We are in one of my most favorite places in the nation of Israel. It's not necessarily one of the most great places in biblical history, but it is incredible how old this place is. We're in the city of Dan, Tel Dan, where the altar of Jeroboam is from over 900 years BC. This is almost 3,000 years old. It's an incredible story how it ended up here, and we're going to tell that story when we look at why the sin of Jeroboam was such a big deal in the nation of Israel. Rehoboam became king after Solomon, and while Solomon was king, God made the decision that he was going to split the kingdom because Solomon had made a lot of bad decisions, which is incredible for the wisest person in the world. But Solomon had married so many wives that carried with them other gods that Solomon began to worship some of those gods. And God made the decision that he was going to split the kingdom, but not totally take it away from the heirs of King David. He went to a prophet and spoke to the prophet to go to Jeroboam. Now, Jeroboam had been someone who was working over the labor force of Solomon, and he had done an incredible job with what he was entrusted to handle. And the prophet came to Jeroboam and said, "Listen, Jeroboam, there's a promise God has for you. He is going to take the kingdom from Solomon's heirs, and he's going to give the kingdom to you, but not completely." And he took a robe, a new robe that he was wearing, he tore it up into 12 pieces, and he gave Jeroboam 10 of the pieces. He said, "God is going to give you 10 of the tribes of Israel, and the next king that would follow Solomon in the line of David would keep 2, which would be Judah and Benjamin." So Jeroboam, after hearing that, was just part of Solomon's force. He was a laborer for Solomon, but now he had a promise from God. So he goes to go back to what he was doing, but Solomon heard what the prophet had told Jeroboam, and he made an effort or took an opportunity to try to kill Jeroboam. So Jeroboam, in order to spare his life, ran down to Egypt and waited there until Solomon would die. Once Solomon was dead, Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, was the next that was appointed to be king. And the people of Israel in the northern part of the kingdom had been under such force of labor that they came to Rehoboam and they said, "Your father has worked us. We built this temple, we built his palaces, we built all this infrastructure. Will you lessen the load that is upon us, and we will be loyal to you and follow you?" Well, Rehoboam went to his father's advisors, and they all said, "Yeah, lessen the load, and they will be loyal to you. They will help you and serve you and follow you if you do that." Well, Rehoboam, being as wise as he is, said, "You know what? Those were the advisors of my father. I'm going to go ask those that are my friends and see what they think." Well, the friends all said, "Rehoboam, you go down there and you show yourself to be even more stronger than your father." And so he went back to the people of Israel and said, "Listen, what my father did at force against you is in my little finger. Essentially, I'm going to be far worse than even my father was." So Jeroboam, who had come up from Egypt during the reign of Rehoboam, comes to this point to serve the people of Israel. And at that point, they all went to their places, their homes in the northern kingdom, and Jeroboam became their king. And Jeroboam, knowing that the people were going to want to go to the temple, made a decision that he would build the temple here. He wanted to build something that would be more convenient for the people up here, really because he was afraid that if they went back to Israel, to the temple to worship and sacrifice, that they would follow Rehoboam eventually. And so he built this place here in Tel Dan and one in Bethel, and which would be a place that would be more convenient for them to worship. If you look at this, you could see the actual altar in which was created where they would make the sacrifices. And then if you go up the stairs, you'd see a platform, and that's where the golden calf would have been placed. They would have had 2 golden calves, one in Bethel and one here in Tel Dan. It's an interesting thing because Jeroboam was promised by God that if if he would be faithful, that God would make him a kingdom just as David was a kingdom. What an incredible promise. I mean, he promised David that he would always have an heir on the throne. And he goes to Jeroboam and says, listen, if you're faithful as David was faithful, and if you will serve me as David served me, I will give you a lineage of kings that will come from you, and there will always be someone in your lineage on the throne. That's an amazing promise to me. We always hear about David, but we never hear about the promise that was given to Jeroboam, the promise that Jeroboam never experienced because he did the exact opposite of what God said he would do. And it's amazing to me because all Jeroboam had to do was look at Rehoboam and realize that even though Solomon had been unfaithful and Rehoboam especially had been unfaithful, God was still faithful to the promise that he had made to David. There are three traps that we can fall into, and one of them is we can forget the credibility of God's promise. Sometimes when we get a promise of the Lord, like Jeroboam did, he had no expectation to be king. He was just someone working in Solomon's workforce. But the prophet comes to him and says, hey, God has called you to be the next king of Israel, and he's going to give you 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel. But that wasn't going to happen in Jeroboam's own ability. And the first trap is forgetting that God didn't give us the promise because he thought we could accomplish it on our own power. I think Jeroboam lost sight of the fact that God didn't give him the promise because he had the ability to do it. God gave him the promise because he wanted to use Jeroboam for a purpose. And we forget sometimes that God is always faithful to fulfill his promise. He doesn't need your help, he just needs your obedience. And the first trap that Jeroboam fell into was he created this place so that the people of Israel wouldn't go back down to Jerusalem to worship in the temple that God had determined would be the place he would reside. You see, Jeroboam didn't want them to go there because he was afraid if they did, they would go back to serving Rehoboam and he would lose the power that he had. He had forgotten that God had made a promise to him. And if God makes a promise to you, you don't need to fear losing the promise if you just obey God and follow where he's taking you. The second trap that Jeroboam fell into was he thought God's promise to him, to Jeroboam, was because God loved Jeroboam. That's an incredible thing. You say, well, did you say that wrong? No, I said it exactly right. The promises God makes to us is because he loved the people of Israel, that he made a promise to Jeroboam that he would make him a great nation. If he would follow the Father, if he would follow God, he would make Jeroboam a great nation, but his responsibility would be to lead the people, to care for the people, and to love the people as God loved the people. God's promise to Jeroboam was for him to love the people of Israel. Jeroboam instead turned it about onto him. He didn't want the people to follow someone else because he wanted the attention. He wanted the people to look to him. He wanted the people to follow him. And he felt like he needed to step in, and he needed not only to make the promise happen, but instead of stewarding what God had promised him, he ended up taking the people as his own and turned the people away from God instead of turning them to the promise maker. God makes promises to every single one of us. And a lot of times we think those promises he makes to us are really all about us. There's a saying in the scriptures that says, to whom much is given, much is required. When God gives us promises, it isn't so that we'll be selfish and let it serve us, that it's all about us. But God fulfills promises in our life so that we can serve the kingdom of God and we can serve God. And when Jeroboam began to get into this position, maybe once his heart was turned toward God when he was with Solomon, but at some point, the position he was put in, when he was given the promise, he wasn't able to handle the promise. He lost perspective of why he had the promise. And I think sometimes we want the promises of God in our life, but we lose perspective for why God gives us the promise. This area is such a beautiful area. And when you look at the third trap, it kind of fits in with everything that Dan is. You know, really, Israel should not even have been in Dan. The tribe of Dan was actually assigned the territory down by Tel Aviv, but they came up here because they couldn't push the Canaanites out of the territory they were assigned to. So they came up to Dan because it was easier, and they defeated the people of Lachish because they were a peaceful people. It was easy. And they brought a Levite with them to be the Levite that would serve them. And this area has really been about that. It's about convenience. We're actually in the northernest part of Israel. It's like a little finger. We have Lebanon up in that direction, Syria in that direction, and you're really surrounded by all of these nations around you. And at that time would have been tribes. The nations of Canaan were all around them. And it is a long way back to Jerusalem. We're a long way from the Sea of Galilee where we're standing right now. When Jeroboam came up here, he was like, listen, worship should be convenient. We need to make it easier for you. And so we're going to we'll create a replica. And what you see here is the altar and the platform where the golden calf was. And you have basically what your community around the temple would be, or the temple mounts here. And you know what? You don't need to go down and do that. And listen, the Levites, they actually kicked all of the Levites out of this area. And they said, you can be your own Levite. You can make up your own belief system, and you come and we'll let you worship here. And you know what? In Jerusalem, you don't have anything you can look at and say that's God, because you can't actually see the Ark of the Covenant. But we're going to put the golden calf up here. And the last time there was a golden calf, it didn't go well for Israel. That was back in the days when Aaron made the golden calf while Moses was up on Mount Sinai. God was not happy with it at all. But Jeroboam said, come and worship here. This is much more convenient for you. You can look at the golden calf, and they even in this place gave God standing stones, as though God himself had idols that would stand in his presence. And it was all about convenience. The third trap is Jeroboam said worship should be all about convenience. Isn't that amazing? In our life, we get so busy with so many things that really we'll worship God when it's convenient. I'll read my Bible when I get time. You know, I'll take time to pray when I'm not so busy. You know, I can't really be at church because we have all of these events going on, and I got these sporting events, and I got, you know, my work I got to do, and I got all these things going on in my life. It's just not that convenient for me, and I need something more convenient. And I really don't like it when you talk about some of the things that maybe need to change in my life, and I just want an uplifting message that tells me how to have a better life, and I want you to tell me how good I'm doing, and I just need something more convenient. You know, what's interesting is every king that would come after Jeroboam, you would see this statement. It said, and they continued in the sin of Jeroboam. And I've often wondered what that meant. They continued in the sin of Jeroboam. Who put Jeroboam on the throne in the first place? Jehovah God put him there. And Jehovah God said, if you put me first, if you declare my name over Israel, I'll be with you. But Israel struggled and never prospered because every king that came after him continued in the sin of Jeroboam. God didn't put his name on this altar. He didn't put his name on this temple. God decided that he was going to reside in the temple of Jerusalem. And every time they came to sacrifice here, every time they came to worship here, they were never worshiping God. They were worshiping the convenience of coming here. You see, when we come to God and we say, I'm going to worship the convenient, I need it to be convenient for me. There's a disconnect. You see, when we realize how incredible God is, when we realize the greatness of God, We put aside convenience and we say, God, I will go to the furthest extent to worship you with everything in me. And it is a privilege and an honor, not an obligation. It is something that's inside of me to be able to worship the great King, Jehovah God. Don't fall into the three traps of Jeroboam, and don't continue in your life in the sin of Jeroboam.